Good afternoon. The Sibley Senior Association, we welcome you to today's event. And as I said, it is being recorded. I am Sharon Sellers, the Community Dementia Program Senior Manager, and I will be your facilitator today. This is our second quarterly book discussion, and we'll be focusing on two books today, White Fragility by Dr. Robin DiAngelo and How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram Kendi. And as we all know, race can be a rather thorny topic, and for people seeking to understand either others' racism or their own, it often can be difficult, and you may not know where to turn. So that's why we've assembled an esteemed panel to guide our book discussion and to hopefully answer any of your questions. So let's go ahead now and let's meet our panelists. Stephen Ragland is on the faculty of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health with advanced degrees in history, cultural studies, and law. He's a senior consultant and former administrator with over 25 years building and managing operations. And he is no stranger to the Sibley Senior Association, as he led a three-part discussion series on racism in America during August of 2020. Joan Mulholland is a civil rights activist who has participated in no less than 50 sit-ins and demonstrations, including the Freedom Rides, the Jackson-Woolworth sit-in, the March on Washington, the Meredith March, and the Selma to Montgomery March. She's appeared on television and many award-winning documentaries, including An Ordinary Hero, PBS Freedom Riders, Standing on My Sister's Shoulders, and the groundbreaking film Eyes on the Prize. She is a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And I might add that she joins the other three panelists who I just learned are also part of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Katrina Myers Caldwell is the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer for Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Caldwell has more than 26 years of leadership experience in diversity and inclusion in higher education. Her interest in her field is certainly informed by her own experiences as a first-generation college graduate from Spelman and a realization in graduate school where she received a doctorate degree in English literature that she wanted to help others like her. And Sharita Hill Golden is the Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer for Johns Hopkins Medicine. Dr. Golden has had a successful career as a physician scientist focused on diabetes, epidemiology, health services research, and disparities. In 2018, Dr. Golden received the 17th annual Women Worth Watching Award from Profiles in Diversity Journal. She was one of 132 winners from across the globe, recognized as executives leading the way to excellence in the workplace, the marketplace, and the world. Welcome our panel. We invite you to submit questions in the Q&A section. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And I want to ask this to all of our panelists. Have these books, White Fragility and How to Be an Anti-Racist, given you understanding of how to talk about our racially divided society? Any thoughts?
Well, not me.
And you
I already talk about it all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, same here. I was quite comfortable, didn't need literature. I mean, I think growing up in my community, you know, Black was the uniform. And so learning to talk about race, you know, early on was, you know, and so it was helpful, but not necessarily that kind of benefit.
Okay, well, let me ask another question a little different way. Have you ever said colorblind or I treat everyone the same. Both authors have explained why these statements serve as barriers to truly grasping the nature of our racially constructed society. Do you agree or disagree?
I'd be happy to comment on that. Having been someone who's been on the receiving end of that comment, not having actually used that comment myself, I think that the challenge with saying that someone is colorblind is you're then dismissing someone's lived experience. That is an important part of who they are. And so, you know, because I'm a physician, I often joke and say, if you can't see that I'm a Black woman, I'm going to make you an appointment at our Wilmer Eye Institute, because I'm actually proud of the fact that I am a Black woman, and that informs who I am and my lived experience, and then how I then translate that experience into my profession, you know, into my family, into who I am. And so to me, to not acknowledge that component of who someone is can be problematic, and particularly in a healthcare setting where people's lived experiences mean that from a healthcare standpoint, they're not starting out at the same place. And so if it's like I'm colorblind and I'm treating everyone the same, then you're not going to be able to achieve equity in that sense, because you're going to be ignoring the differences and realizing we're not actually all starting at the same place.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, I think we should always recognize color. It's not helpful to pretend it doesn't exist. So I've never said it, and I would fight against it, argue against it. I'm not violent, no fighting.
Fine.
My comments will be very similar to Dr. Golden, in the sense that when you've experienced that, I've had the fortune or misfortune of being the first or the only Black man in almost every professional experience for the first 20 years of my work career. And usually when someone approached me and said that they didn't see color, I mean, it was an indication that you were literally lopping off, you were seeing the parts of me that were comfortable for you. I mean, so that part of that, again, I didn't need that kind of explanation, because, you know, I had that kind of that lived experience, but it was really illuminating to hear how both of them unpack that phenomenon that people of color tend to experience and live every day in professional life and in personal life.
Okay.
I, in alignment with that, I would agree. I think that language evolves over time.
Sure.
And so what colorblind may have meant 15, 20 years ago as a way of being more inclusive has shifted in the recognition that systems have more impact on us than we were willing to, that many folks were willing to acknowledge and recognize. And I think for the two books, what I think about is it's a continuing conversation for folks like us who've had these lived experiences. It's not a start of a conversation. And I think that's an important point to make. I also think there's certain things that resonate with certain folks. So there's certain things that folks, when they read, you know, they read these two texts, for the first time there's an awakening, but it was because of the moment we were in that there were awakening. But it doesn't mean that this conversation hasn't happened. So it's almost like you're on a train and people are talking about race and people are talking about anti-racism, and there's this lively historical conversation about white privilege that King and Frederick Douglass and Fannie Lou Hamer and all those folks talked about white fragility. They just didn't use those frameworks, right? The more recent folks who don't look like D'Angelo talked about, I mean, Brittany Cooper in her Eloquent Black Women's Rage talks about white women's tears. So she's there. So they're talking about the same thing.
Absolutely.
And then certain people get on the bus or the train at a stop and they're like, wow, this is enlightening. This is powerful. But the rest of us who've been on this train, some of us 30, 40, 50, 60 years, this is just a continuation of a long conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Caldwell.
I want to add to what Dr. Caldwell mentioned, because I think for me, what was eye-opening for me for white fragility is it finally gave a name to this thing I would experience whenever I would challenge something or bring up race. I just didn't like, it had not been termed white fragility. And I remember two years ago having a conversation with my son who was reading this book in one of his college African-American studies courses. And I was explaining, being at a meeting and going up to the mic and asking a question about race and gender intersectionality. And I said, I guess my question sparked a lot of questions because now like this journal wants me to write a commentary about this. And so my son said, well, Mom, that shouldn't have been a big deal. I mean, I don't understand why your comment sparked all that interest. He's like, that's an example of white fragility. And I was like, what are you talking about? And then he told me about the book and I'm like, oh, that is the name of what it is that I have experienced for the 50 some years of my life when I say something and everyone retreats and gets defensive, but it hadn't been given a name or popularized. So that was the interesting thing for me. I had been experiencing that my entire life, but this book gave it a name.
Absolutely.
That's ironic that we talk about that language because like we did have a language for it in my community, but mostly it was usually, I mean, I heard it around the women in my family, and that was white girl tears. You know, terrible things happen when you like, and so it wasn't white fragility. I mean, and like literally, and the thing that was really interesting about that was I think she talked, D'Angelo talks about it in its, more or less in its completeness, right? I mean, but white girl tears tend to, engender this racism, this soft racism, right, that happened solely around women, which was very different than the vitriolic history that you saw for men. And so kind of watch that like unpack, but it wasn't the first time I'd heard it. Like I said, I grew up hearing it and being warned about it, like, when white girls cry, dude, bad things happen.
Thank you. Let me ask a follow-up question to that is, we've talked about white privilege. How do you explain privilege to those white families who say they've been struggling possibly for generations? They're white and they're poor, and they refuse to accept that they have privilege. What do you say?
That's a hard one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I agree.
But I think their family has a chance, maybe a snowball's chance, where, to get out of it. But at least they have a chance. I come from, my grandmother was a sharecropper, and we could get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
If we'd been Black, we'd probably still be
Okay.
stuck. Yeah.
Well, let me ask maybe a different type of question. If someone says to you, I don't understand, I have been shaped by my whiteness, what might you say to them?
Well, I would just add that, I think this is a moment to, as both books do, try to articulate the difference between individual lived experiences, which have been devalued in marginalized or minoritized communities. So our lived experiences, until they're put in a book, someone writes about them, someone gives them legitimacy, that has been undervalued. People don't care about that. People, they say that's anecdotal. Where's the data to suggest this? And on the other hand, when a minoritized person or a white person says, that's not my lived experience, we give that legitimacy. Somehow their lived experiences has more legitimacy than the system that we know that distributes this access and opportunity, because all the data that they do value suggests that their lived experience is not correct. So it is just those moments where you point out this is an institutional, this is an institutional issue. So think about it in an institutional way And to what Joan said, and I totally agree with her, is how do you think about opportunity, right? Like how do you think about the way folks define their opportunity, not the way they lived their experience? In the same way, in the reverse, we've been told your lived experience is not important, and there are all these opportunities, and we know that's not our experience, right? So trying to clarify with folks that they have to think differently. The other thing I think that I've been saying to folks for a while is that whiteness and not paying attention to whiteness hurts white people too. Not paying attention to privilege and not paying attention to power, it hurts them too, because folks who can't access it get blamed for not being able to access it. And it creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of the issues that we're seeing that are happening in terms of coping and the way people are coping and the mental health and all of that, because people are trying to live up to what whiteness says the kind of life they should have. So, it's both and. It's reframing their viewpoint to say just because you haven't lived it doesn't mean that's not the reality. And two, that it hurts them too. That framework hurts them as well.
And I think we also have to think about privilege, in a broader way, to help, maybe our white colleagues not to become so defensive if someone says that you have white privilege, because you can be privileged in different ways, right? So all of us on this panel are privileged in having had an education, and that's a separate issue, from race. So the fact that, I'm a Black woman who went to college and then a medical school, as a first generation student, just being educated gives me a whole set of privileges that, perhaps my parents didn't have by not having gone to college, right? So it's sort of saying that race is that's like one angle of privilege. And unfortunately in our country, that's the power dynamic on which the nation was built. But the point is that, you can have privilege in a lot of dimensions, but unfortunately the privilege around race has been more polarizing because of the way our institutions and policies were set up. But we have to recognize we can be privileged in many ways. You can be privileged by being able as opposed to disabled, educated as opposed to not educated. So there are multiple dimensions. I think that it's important to recognize that. So when someone really gets taken aback when you say you have white privilege, I say, well, I have educational privilege. And because I have that, it is incumbent upon me to understand those who are not, what the challenges are for those who don't have that privilege, and how can I advocate and ally for those who don't. And so really trying to help them think about it, in a different way to address the defensiveness.
Thank you. Thank you.
And to understand situation, I'd recommend people watch my son's documentary, The Uncomfortable Truth, which is the history of institutional racism. And he takes it right from the get-go.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just walk a little deeper into, Dr. Kendi's book. And something that I thought really resonated with me is that he described his survival from metastatic stage 4 colon cancer. And he states that we here in the US are facing metastatic racism with increasing racial inequities. And let me just share a quote from the book, and then I want you to respond to it. He says, "The source of racist ideas is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest. This history of racist ideas is the history of powerful policymakers erecting racist policies out of self-interest, then producing racist ideas to defend and rationalize the inequitable effects of their policies, while everyday people consume those racist ideas, which in turn sparks ignorance and hate." And so he went on to say, treating ignorance and hate and expecting racism to shrink is like treating a cancer patient's symptoms and expecting the tumors to shrink. Do you agree or disagree with these statements?
Amen. Pass the gravy.
Wholeheartedly. I mean, historically, when you think in terms of our founding was predicated on this idea of a new model of economics, a new capitalism, if you will. And that whole notion was predicated on stealing two things. I mean, there's only 4 resources, right? And they stole 2 of them, land and hands, right? And then they used the, and then, and it's the wealthy and the powerful at that point in time. But I think the more interesting notion is how Kendi talks about like how everyday people who are not the 1%ers, who are not the wealthy and powerful, how, how the well-to-do inculcated these people with nuanced notions about race, right? In particular, using religion at first and then science and medicine, right? To make sure that everybody had a place, that everybody had a role. I mean, and we still subscribe to those notions today. I mean, one of the things that last question, I always challenge folks when we talk about privileges. Well, you show me an economy, let's talk about the macro, not the micro. You show me an economy where you would trade places with me. You show me any economy where you would trade places with me.
Well said.
So, yeah, so I agree with that wholeheartedly. We baked it into the cake.
And it wasn't a prize.
Yeah, I would agree that particular passage I thought was like so riveting and powerful, because I mean, we definitely would not treat a disease like cancer by treating the superficial. Like you got to go in, you've got to like surgically remove it, you've got to like reconstruct organs, bypass things when something's blocked, give it chemotherapy and kill it. And so that really gives us an eye toward how do we really begin to dismantle the policies and that have put these things in place, that we're still living the residual of that. And it's interesting in my field of healthcare, people are like, well, how do you go from being like a diabetes clinician and researcher to a chief diversity officer? Well, it's interesting because, in medicine, even, we now realize that it's the conditions in which people live, their opportunity for education, their opportunity to live in housing that's not by, pollutants that are causing chronic asthma that really impact their health. So if we actually want to improve the health of the nation, it's not just giving them access to the best hospital, but it's giving them access to housing, to exercise facilities, to food. I mean, like these basic things that our policies have resulted in inequities and access to. So it's really like a completely different way of thinking about how we approach everything in our country and taking this broader look at things.
Thank you, Dr. Golden. Dr. Kendi has said that the heartbeat of racism is denial, and that the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. Do you think that we can move forward as a country if we're not willing to admit the ways in which our ideas and our policies are racist?
We'll just perpetuate it until we admit it.
So let me think. That's a complicated question. So it's like, I thought Kendi's book was absolutely spot on in a whole lot of places, but I had trouble with his binary at sometimes, like this racist kind of like anti-racist, kind of format, because I think that it did not allow for, when you talk about economies, we always choose self. We always choose self-preservation. I mean, and when you see like like my mom always told me, like, you always have choices. They may not be great choices, but you always have choices. And I don't think that that binary allows for the tough economic choices that folks have to make, where they literally can't stand on principles.
Does anyone else want to respond to that?
And I agree. I definitely agree with that. Both what Ms. Holland said and what Mr. Ragsdale said. I think that, however, nuance is often lost
That's exactly right.
in our society.
Uh-huh.
And so I think for a certain segment of our population, you have to use those that tool in order to get folks' attention. I also do agree that nuance is still important, right? So if we're going to teach folks, we're going to move folks from one moment to another. We can't say, oh, today you're anti-racist, tomorrow you're racist, right? We got to be careful about operationalizing that. But the what you asked about reconciliation is such a long overdue project. And it happens in fits and starts. And even the moments in our history that have been recognized, like South Africa reconciliation, is still unsatisfying. So there's so much work to be done in the reconciliation space, and we haven't even begun that work. It's not even about reparations. This is about an acknowledgement of what Mr. Ragsdale just articulated, that our populace, the last election, right? I'm in Mississippi right now, actually visiting my family in Byhalia, Mississippi, and they have rejected infrastructure support. They've now rejected the federal income relief for unemployment, and Mississippi falls at the bottom of every policy marker around poverty that you can find. And yet the government doesn't seek the need for relief, and the people don't, the people who would normally be impacted by that aren't speaking up. So, just thinking about the lack of access people have when and then they'll blame other people for the condition that they're in. So it's just a vicious cycle, and it's just it's just a system. It's just a project that is so long overdue, and hopefully it'll be in my lifetime that we'll start it. But it's unfortunate.
I have another comment to add to that. It just may be a different angle on the question that you asked. And Mr. Ragsdale will appreciate this, but I just am a strong believer, though, that it is so critical to understand our nation's real history, because we cannot begin to understand where we're going if we don't understand where we've come from. And I came from a very strong civil rights, social justice family. My brother and father were at the 1963 March on Washington. Maybe Ms. Mulholland, they saw you there. I don't know.
Only if they were in the press. I was working in the press tent.
Okay, they were in the press. But so this was sort of like what I grew up with, and they were very intentional about making sure I knew my history. But even with that, I was doing my master's in the School of Public Health. I already finished medical school, finished my whole residency before anybody talked to me about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. How absurd is that? I was 4 years old when the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was revealed. And I even have asked my family, why didn't we talk about that? I mean, they may have talked about it. I was 4. But the point is that how do I get through my entire medical education? And I don't hear about this until I'm doing a master's when I'm almost 30 years old. And so that is why, since that time, I have made it an intentional part of my own, journey in medicine, is to really understand what are all those historical practices and policies that are contributing to the poor health that we see in minoritized communities. And my husband and I making sure that our son is fully aware of those realities, because you can't, and we all work in institutions with storied histories, and we even, organizationally, no matter what organization we work in, need to sort of own our history and acknowledge, that was terrible. And this is what we need to do to move forward. Right. And so I think that we have, I feel like the history I got was slaves were brought here on ships. There was slavery. It was kind of bad. And then there was a civil war, and then everyone was emancipated, and there was a civil rights movement, and it's all been good. And that is not what's happened. There were so many holes in that history that has been taught. And so I think that, you know, when he's talking about that in his book, I think that that's part of what he's getting at, is we need to acknowledge what has happened.
To justify, and Dr. Golden, I do appreciate that so much. That is a kind of like a softball. I mean, in the sense that when I think in terms of being a historian and telling kind of like the Black narrative in this country from 1619 to like the reason that, you know, before I read those books, I heard that they were controversial, but it was easy for me to understand, like halfway through them, why they were controversial. Because with respect to America's history, we don't know America's history. We know America's resume. We know, like, you know, and we start the clock 150 years, 160, you know, years in, you know, on telling that story. And we don't, unless you read in Howard Zinn, you know, you're not hearing that story from the protagonist. You're hearing it from the antagonist, right? You know what I mean? And so, like, I mean, just to kind of give you a note of this, I'm a historian. I had to go, and didn't go to law school that long ago. But I had to go to law school, to Dr. Golden's point, to find out that the neighborhood that I grew up in, that we moved to in 1975, sued the college that I went to prevent them from building on land that it had already purchased. I'm a historian and I didn't know that story, right? And so, like, and grew up in that neighborhood. My father belonged to the group who actually sued, right? And somebody hands me, you know, I had to take an elective, you know, in my last year of school in order to, like, you know, to be privy to that. And had I not chosen that elective, I probably still wouldn't know that story. You know, I mean, and so, like, you know, understanding, like, privilege, you can't understand privilege until you understand what's been privileged to you, and, you know, and all of those and all the iterations around that, right? And so thanks for that, Dr. Golden. I totally completely agree.
Yeah, I have a quick question for our friend in Mississippi. D'Angelo says that, like most white people raised in the US, I was not taught to see myself in racial terms, and certainly not to draw attention to my race or to behave as if it mattered in any way. Well, that doesn't sound like Mississippi as I remember it. Or the South, or a good deal of the US, but particularly Mississippi. Have things changed that much?
Not at all. You're absolutely correct.
Well, I think she's just one of them Yankees, you know. And she doesn't, though she mentions that some European folks, you know, the Irish, the Italian and all, were discriminated against. But up through the 1920 census, Italians were listed as colored. So she couldn't pass the one drop rule herself. And I think she's missing a few points.
Let me just talk about what some critics of D'Angelo have said, and I just want you to tell me how you feel about that. Some of her critics have actually said that she's trying to fix white people's souls, when in reality, the place that people should look is at institutions and their policies. How do you feel about that statement?
I think that's pretty accurate, because we are a product, our souls are a product of the institutions and what have you that we grow up in. And it's few of us that, you know, get a different perspective.
Yeah,
I was not a great fan of hers, but we knew that.
So I want to share a different perspective. I think that, and again, you know, I'm ambivalent about the book, but I think that one of the things that she was talking about was not so much like what was in people's heart, but more or less like their level of acceptance of even receiving the information, like literally that they have barriers up here, you know. And so even when we're having this discussion, that this level of fragility that you know, that makes you shut down and don't want to hear absolutely anything. So I don't even think we got to the part where they, you know, where she was talking about, like, you know, their feelings, their direct feelings, but like I think she was talking about their interpretation of the information, and like their unwillingness, their unflinching unwillingness to not hear anything about it for such a long period of time.
Could be.
And individuals can
Go ahead,
influence.
Dr. Golder.
Yeah, I was gonna say individuals can also influence policy and procedure and the structures. And so if in fact you say, well, this policy disadvantages, you know, one group over another, and then somebody shuts that down, and it's like, well, I don't, this is not a racist policy. I don't agree with what you're saying. Like, that's a form of white fragility as well. So it could be interpersonal, and I think it also has relevance to systems, because people have power and control over systems.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think, and I agree with both of those points. And I also, there is a part of me, and what Ms. Mulholland pointed to, that when I read the book, sort of creates hairs on the back of my neck to stand up on the back of my neck, because even when I first heard the title Fragility, that evokes a different sort of reaction than fear, because that's what I feel like if I had to retitle this book, it's about fear, but what is the fear of, right? And fragility suggests a certain type of vulnerability that I don't know if I yet want to yield to, that I want to assign to folks, right? Like I feel like, there's a bit of complicity in this. So I've worked, I worked at the University of Mississippi, and I won't speak about that experience in particular, but I will say that I would go into communities and people would say, well, Katrina, why can't we talk about how white folks are feeling about the particular changes that are happening in this particular case? And I thought, and because they don't, for instance, about, folks being outside of housing or not being allowed in systems, I said, it's a system that you have controlled. So you understand the system, right? This is not a lack of knowledge or understanding or even vulnerability. This is about someone's going to shine a light on the fact that we control this system. And if someone starts tinkering around and looking at the system, they're going to see who the wizard really is. They're going to see what the power bases really are. And they're going to go after the power base. And there are folks who are vulnerable to the institution who are equally complicit. They just don't know that they are being used in that way.
Sure.
So that for me, it's just like, I struggled with that. And the fact that there are some folks who are very clear about what they're doing. And unless we, I don't know, I mean, I know that Vaughn and other folks have put power in the chat. We hear you. But the white power moniker means something that white fragility does not. Right. And that for me is important to know, to take note of.
Yeah. Let me just talk a little bit about one of the things that Dr. Kendi spoke a lot about when he was really talking about the difference between being not racist and anti-racist. And he went on to say that, or let me just say in general, some say that silence is violence, and that to be neutral is to be racist. And if you're not actively fighting racism or being anti-racist, you're part of the problem. Is that an idea you agree with?
So, so, so that, I mean, I think I spoke on this a little earlier, and I have a great appreciation for what Dr. Caldwell said, because I understand why he wrote that binary, right? I mean, but I think what it does is it shuts down the conversation for much more sophisticated people around in critical race theory. And critical race theory has been around for what, 40 or 50 years at this point in time. It's not a new construct, right? And it's sophisticated, and it's a discipline. You know, started at Harvard and Stanford University law schools. I mean, so like literally what it does is, I mean, you know, that is, it makes the conversation way too simple. And I think the problem is way too complex.
Okay. Well, oh, go ahead, Dr. Golden. It looks like you're trying to say something.
Yeah, I think so I agree, like when we try to dichotomize things, that we, you know, there are some nuanced complexities that can't be addressed, but I do think what the concept does is get people from thinking individually, well, as long as I'm not racist, I don't mistreat people, then I'm good, to being more action oriented in terms of thinking more about allyship. And if I am in a position of power and authority where I can change policy, infrastructure, process, hiring, promotions to bring about equity, then I'm going to do that. So I think it really moves people from their own individual action to thinking more about like sort of collective and broader action and influence.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Golden. I'm still certainly, people, if you want to put questions in the Q&A, we definitely, you know, still have some time where we can respond to them. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, all of us are asked to think about what an anti-racist society might look like and how we can play an active role in building it. So I turn to you right now. I mean, we know that anti-racist refers to people who are actively seeking not only to raise their consciousness about race and racism, but also to take action when they see racial power inequities in everyday life. Where might we begin to address everyday racism?
In our neighborhood.
Okay, why don't you expound on that?
Well, if you have a neighbor who's different from you, whether it's Jewish or Black or Asian or whatever, or white, that might be different, welcome them. Speak to them publicly.
Okay.
Little things like that, but you start where you are.
Is that being active enough, do you think?
I think it's a good start.
Okay.
I say speak out where you can. If somebody says something that, you know, is racist, counter it. If there's a march going on near you, you can join it and carry a sign. Or if you can't march, if you're old like me and your knees aren't up to it, you can help make the signs.
Okay.
Spread the publicity. Somebody has to drive the cars to get people places and cook some food sometimes. A lot of things you can do, aside from being, you know, front and center. And yeah, this old saying, bloom where you're planted. So do what you can do where you are.
Thank you, Ms. Mulholland.
I would narrow that a little bit. I like Ms. Mulholland's response, and I would narrow it even further and say start with you. What I mean by that is start with oneself and understanding how you participate in the system every day, right? We live in an economic racism matrix, or matrix, if you will, and which is hard to escape. I live in the community of people who don't look like me, and that was an economic choice. And it was an economic choice that, you know, in long run, whether I'm honest about it or not, you know, hurts people who look like me. You know, we sit in jobs every day. We people of color, we otherize and we disconnect ourselves from a community that people who don't look like us would never disconnect us from. You know, so it becomes a you know, the separation that we do becomes a worthless kind of exercise. And so I think the best thing that you can do is racism in America was built on economic principles. You have to understand how you are making economic sense of them every day.
And I would also say is, you know, is using your position to be able to be an ally. And so one of my favorite phrases, you know, without coming out and saying, wow, that was a racist comment, particularly if there aren't that many, you know, people of color in the room, is just to say, I'm sorry, could you help me understand what you meant by that? And that makes like everybody pause, you know, take a breather and just begin to really like dissect and really listen to that comment and realize the inappropriateness of it, right? Because a lot of times you think that, okay, I've got to call organizational equity and file a report and all of those things. There are like many things you can do without getting to that point, and you can actually be much more effective. And so like, ouch is another one of my, you know, a boss I worked with, someone would say something toxic to me. He was like, ouch, everybody pause. And then like, so help me understand what you meant by that. Or I'm surprised to hear you say that. Can you explain to me what you mean? And so there are ways, there are disarming ways to begin to address and disentangle some of that on an individual level. And if you are a leader, then you're actually really having an impact on the system that you're sitting in, because other people are watching what you do and they will begin to recognize, okay, well, we're in the room with this particular leader, he or she is not going to tolerate that kind of language or tone. And so like, that's how you begin to make change. And so I have seen leaders of color do that, and I have seen white leaders do that. And it's very powerful. And, you know, you'd be really surprised by saying, help me understand, how that can pause the whole conversation and send something going down the tubes in a different direction. So just, you know, really thinking about how to reframe and get people to hear themselves.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Golden. Dr. Caldwell.
So I go both in. I think the personal journey, self-awareness, self-reflection. I also think interruption, intervention, disruption, whatever you want to call it, is important. We obviously, but I do think institutional structural change, where you can, making the system visible as much as you possibly can, is important. And even if that's as all of the panelists have said before, what part of the system in which you fall in, where you bloomed, where you live, where you work, where you don't work, where you don't live, where you don't work, right? And being very explicit about how those systems impact you and impact other people, right? Because there's a sorting that happens, that people are quick to sort, particularly, you know, POC folks, BIPOC folks, to say, you're not like the X because of where you live, because of where you work, even for how you speak or where you went to school, or, you know, all those ways we set people aside apart. We have to be very explicit about not only our roots, our lived experiences, but our connections to those, and how we are not a product of this system. The system wasn't meant for us to advance. So when someone else wants to take credit for my advancement came from my grandmother and my great-great-grandmother, right? Those are the people who are responsible for my advancement, and my great-great-grandfathers, right? And so just being explicit about that, and challenging those systems and making them visible. This policy, this program, this initiative, this practice, this belief, this tradition, this way we articulate our institutions, values, all are baked in, as Mr. Ragsdale said before. All of that's baked in. We have to dismantle it, right?
Perfect. Can you see if you can break this down for our audience? According to Dr. Kendi, he would say that the health inequities that we saw during the COVID pandemic, where you had Blacks and Latinx having death rates twice of white people, or other inequities just like that, were due to racist policies. And if you that, many of us are in the healthcare field, what could we have done differently, or what can we do differently now so that should we have the next pandemic, things aren't going to be like they are right now?
I have one policy idea. If you've ever taken Graham Mooney's class, The History of Public Health in Baltimore City, you'll know that Baltimore has been spending 50% of what is necessary on public health for 150 years. Right? We have one of the oldest public health. Start putting them equity. You have to raise those boats, right? And so like what COVID did was it exposed our public health nightmare that was dormant, and just waiting for an epidemic to expose it. Okay. And so like the only cure to that is to be prepared the next time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And sadly, within a week of COVID, I was not surprised by what we were seeing because the conditions were already in place. So, and we'd had 100 years. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, but I've been in Baltimore for almost 27 years. And so, the history of redlining, that started in Baltimore and spread to other cities in the U.S., where we have neighborhoods that have been economically disadvantaged for like over a century. And so now you have people living in crowded housing. They have jobs where they don't have paid sick leave, that if you actually take off, you will lose income, inadequate health insurance. It was a setup for what we saw, to the point that within the first week of the pandemic being declared, our health system president, Kevin Sowers, collaborated with the health system president, University of Maryland Medical System, said that our two systems, really as the two anchor like medical systems in Baltimore, need to come together in a public-private partnership with CareFirst Blue Cross Blue Shield, because we're going to need to help the city partner with the city health department and the Maryland State Health Department to make sure Baltimore gets what it needs. So within a week, it was very clear that partnership was going to be needed, necessary, for a field hospital, for a recovery hotel to be stood up, to get COVID testing to nursing homes and homeless shelters and marginalized communities, because of the gap that Mr. Ragsdale talked about. And so, because there was that recognition, we were able to begin to act early, but still had all of those deaths. And so now it's now that we are aware of this, what can we do? And, we've worked really closely with our government affairs office to advocate for health equity legislation in the last Maryland session that was signed into law that is going to begin to address some of those things, because it's hard to undo a century and more really of historical practices that influence health in a short time frame. It's going to take policy, rebuilding, infrastructure investment. It's not more hospitals. It's more housing. It is better educational systems. It is, police reform and all of those things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would also add that for me, what was striking about the pandemic or any other moment of crisis is who gets to make decisions. Who's informed enough to make decisions. And so there are colleagues of mine who've been talking about, or in higher education, will talk about resiliency and having a resilience curriculum and pedagogy. And I'm thinking, we've been doing resiliency work for since the turn, right? And so it's just was ironic. It was just to sit on calls with people saying, We have to figure out how to help our students face challenges. And we have to be flexible in the face of the pandemic, or we have to create all the things that people have been asking for in higher education since the integration of higher education. All of a sudden now we're fair game during the pandemic, right? And, thinking about who would have built this system differently, people who already knew what it meant to be resilient, people already knew how to face crisis, people who knew the type of flexibility that was necessary to address inequities. None of those people were in positions of power to make those decisions, right? Absolutely. And so we would have gotten to a better outcome earlier had they been in those positions.
Thank you. We're winding down. I have two more questions for you. One comes from Michelle Gordine in the audience. What role do leaders play to promote true inclusion and that fellow people of color in our workplaces are seen and heard for who they are, rather than the expectation of conformity to the traditional white male view of power?
Ooh, Michelle, you're something else. Ooh, how do you get people? Show them the money. This is, one of the things that what I do when I work on systems change and majority culture, my work is in systems theory and systems design, and it's in history. So I can show them like not only how this affects them, but how is this affected them and for how long it's this affected them, right? And like, again, a lot of times they have not been, I was told a couple of weeks ago, I'm doing this executive training session, I was told, it was said, I felt like I never paid attention in class before. You make me feel like you were never taught this. It's like nobody's ever shared this with you before, and so like, if focusing on both of those places, I think will kind of get us to a good place.
Okay.
And I think I would add that I think we have to use whatever platform we're given to give voice to and advocate for those perhaps whose voices are not typically heard, and to bring those voices to the table. And I sort of feel that as awful as the pandemic has been, that has also been an opportunity, at least for our organization, to really begin to hear for the first time, because those of us who are in leadership and have been in leadership during the pandemic, we're bringing that reality. And I remember when we were talking about our vaccine rollout to employees, and one of our leaders said, well, when people, we wanted to make sure like our security staff and others, were getting the vaccine. So we had done a special call center so they could call in and get that done, because the computer was a barrier. And I remember one of our leaders said, and while they're sitting with the 15 minutes of observation, we can talk to them about the importance of signing up for my chart, because that's an important way to manage your health. I said, if we want to improve their health, we will get them better housing and make sure they have adequate pay, right? And so it's just a matter of bringing that perspective to the table and bringing the voices of those who typically have not been heard, bringing those voices into the C-suite and into the executive leadership. And I like what Steve said about connecting it to the bottom line, because we know it's about mission, right? But like no money, no mission. And so showing them that if we don't achieve our health equity targets, you recognize we're not going to get reimbursed. And now Leapfrog is asking about patient outcomes by different demographic groups. And, Vizient is going to start asking about this. So understanding like what's coming down the pipe and being able to like recouch it in the language they can hear. So you're getting the mission done and also like meeting the bottom line at the same time.
Thank you, Dr. Golden. Okay, here is our final question, and we'll do it really quickly as we're approaching the end of the session. What is your final message to our audience? Do you have a call to action for them, or just something that you want to leave with them to think about?
Well, my generation took care of legal segregation, but we still have all this racism alive and well. So get out there and do something.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Mulholland.
Yeah, and I think I would add, I've had a favorite quote during the pandemic, and I'm trying to find it on all these photos on my phone that are not organized. But the quote essentially said, that someone had sent it to me, but it said, if we had normal, before the pandemic hit, and I would say we've had two pandemics that have really revealed themselves. Pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the racism pandemic. One of which has been going on for hundreds of years. The other has been going on the last 15 months. And then what it said is that normal wasn't working. So if we go back to what was normal, then we would have lost and missed the lesson. And I think that's what I want people to think about, is that our goal should not be to let's get everything back to the way it was before the pandemic or before George Floyd was murdered. But it's really how do we take the tragedy of those experiences and really build a new normal and a better society.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Caldwell.
So I would actually say what both have said before me, in terms of hopefully our generation will be able to say we handled something, Ms. Mulholland, that there was a completion, that there was that there was work that we got done in our lifetime. And to what Dr. Golden said, I totally agree. The other thing that I will say is that unfortunately more Black men are going to die, and more folks are going to die as a result of this pandemic. And that can't be the only thing that inspires you to wake up every morning and do this work. It just can't be, right? Because, Dr. Golden and I talk about this often. We have boys. I have 3 boys. Yeah. And every time they leave the house, every time they call me, my son just went from Indianapolis to Myrtle Beach, and all I could think about were all the cops he was going to engage on along the way, or all the opportunities for him to engage the system along the way, versus he's going to have a fun time at the beach. Yeah. Right. So this is not a reality that's going to go away, but that we just have to do this. We have to be committed to doing this work all the time, every day. It has to be integrated into the work we do all the time.
Wonderful.
Oh, I think that we are at an inflection point as a historian. I think that we are marking a time. History moves in cycles. And I think right now we are marking a time that we get an opportunity to push the envelope a little bit further than we ever have before, if taking the chance. This struggle has been going on for a really, really, really long time. But I think that right now, with the way that information moves, the speed of the information moves, and the access that we have, society is much more connected. I think that we are sitting at a really special time, and I think that most of us sitting on this call are taking advantage of it. And I would think that the folks that would be my call to action, right? Take advantage of this time. We've been waiting for this for a long time. And I think this is, don't miss the boat on this.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists. The Sibley Senior Association is so grateful for your participation, as well as all of the persons that joined us. We are not stopping here. We're continuing with our next quarterly discussion on race, September 22nd. You'll be hearing more about this. It's something that we feel so strongly about and are so committed to, and we hope that you will join us in these efforts as we begin these conversations. And we're just so thankful for everyone's insights and participation. And if we didn't get to all of your questions, I do apologize, but certainly we invite you back for our next session. And on that, I just want to say thank you again and good evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.